Go. Okay, great. Thank you for being here. It's the second session of the CEFISES Seminar. And today we have the pleasure of having Jana De Kockere, who's going to tell us a bit about the controversy of the 17th century, but I think also some ramifications for today's discourse about nature. So yeah, please. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. So yes, I'm a PhD student affiliated with the University of Ghent. I'm in the philosophy department there. And I will present to you parts of my dissertation, which I'm in the process of writing. And while researching the past years, I've been more and more interested to define myself as a historian. I like relating to the discipline of history more than to the discipline of philosophy. I like pretending to be a historian, and I like having to relate myself to the virtue of historical accuracy. But I've been trained as a philosopher, and especially in the subdiscipline of epistemology. And the tradition I mostly affiliate myself with, we talked a bit just now during lunch, is that of historical epistemology. It's a definition used by my colleague Massimiliano Simons. So we are like a bit against people who follow like Foucault and like who influence Foucault and like French tradition of doing epistemology and tackling epistemic questions. So the questions there are like, how have regimes of knowledge changed and reformed ideas of what counts as valid, good, true, legitimate knowledge? And how to relate the discontinuities of history with intuitions of truth and rationality as being eternal and ahistoric, unchangeable. So one of the methodological questions is, what is the right distribution between eternity and historicity? Or to put it in the concepts of my 17th century actors of my historical case study, what is the right distribution between the mutable and the immutable, the changeable and the unchangeable? And a central place in historical epistemology is given to knowledge institutions. How do they try in this ever-changing world to keep stable certain ideas and methods of knowledge production such that we can differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate knowledge, legitimate and illegitimate knowledge producers? And so by completing this PhD, by defending my thesis, hopefully in the near future, I will lend the university the legitimacy to transform me into a legitimate speaker. So defending this thesis will be an act of my belief in the university. It might be the clearest possible sign of such belief. Yet at the same time, in conversations amongst colleagues, either PhD students or people further along their academic careers, I tend to disavow the university, and I'm not alone. Regularly, we express our distrust in universities as spaces that produce trustworthy knowledge. Let me give just one example that was provided to be my colleague Marie-Gabrielle Verbecht, who recently defended her dissertation on the history of European research funding for historical research and its implications for what counts as good or valid historical knowledge. So she started collecting during her research jokes and memes that embody the frustrations about applying for research funding in department lunchrooms. But despite the cynicism, we keep defending PhD theses and we keep applauding colleagues who do so. What does that mean? Are we cynical? Are we hypocritical? It's one possible explanation. But in becoming historian, I take as my guide, my principal guide, the French historian Michel de Certeau. In the preface of the English translation of The Possession at Loudun, Stephen Greenblatt summed up the virtue of Certeau as a historian with an anecdote from the history of the possession itself. That history started in 1632 with the vision of a black sphere appearing in the middle of the night to Jeanne des Anges, the prioress of the convent. And it ended 2 years later, after long exorcisms and a trial, with the burning at the stake of the convent's priest Urbain Grandier, accused of having made a pact with the devil. And Greenblatt recounted how after the execution of Grandier, Jana De toured all over France with on her hand the miraculous inscription of the names of those who had finally triumphed over the devils: Jesus, Maria, and Saint François de Sales. And once Jana De returned to her convent, she kept putting her hand on display for visitors to come see it. And one day she received one Balthazar de Montconi, who did something unexpected, as he himself described. With the tip of my fingernail, with a light touch, I removed the leg of the M of the word Maria, which surprised her greatly. I was satisfied with that and took my leave of her. Stephen Greenblatt commented, "It is a tribute to Michel de Certeau, who gives this and still more devastating evidence of miserable fraud, that he is not so easily satisfied." Now, in a review of this book, historian David Wootton compared Certeau's possession to Aldous Huxley's popular history of the same possession, which is often summarized as a psychological study of sexual hysteria. So Aldous Huxley understands or explains the possession at Loudun as sexual hysteria. The women were all in love with Urbain Grandier, were frustrated, angry, and then took him together as like an embodiment of the devil to get rid of him. So Wootton wrote, Huxley's Devils of Loudun may seem dated in that Huxley constantly seeks to describe what really happened, whereas Certeau gives us the radically incompatible accounts of believers and atheists, doctors and theologians, leaving us to pick our own way between them. But why should we deny ourselves the satisfaction de Montconi felt when he realized he knew what was really going on? Now, what kind of difference is that between being satisfied when knowing what is really going on and to refuse to be so easily satisfied? What kind of satisfaction is that to claim for oneself? And why would someone want to deny it to themselves? So during my years of becoming historian, I grew an attraction to Certeau's denial and stubbornness, without exactly understanding what it is. Perhaps the desire not to be satisfied arises out of the fact that such satisfaction can instantly transform into disappointment. Is that all there is to it? Now, is there all there is to what? Now I can arrive to the actual subject of my thesis. It has become increasingly difficult to understand how to properly introduce it. That subject is the controversy between Godfrey Goodman and George Hakewill, two early 17th century clergymen, over the decay of nature in early 17th century England. During the years that I was researching the case, I repeatedly received the comment when I would explain it to someone that my research was very relevant. And of course, that's why I had chosen it. But the longer I kept searching, the more its relevance escaped me. And the more also I became incredibly dissatisfied with my original research motivations, which stemmed from a recognition of myself in the question at stake. It is with me, therefore, perhaps not unlike as with Godfrey Goodman himself, the little remembered Anglican priest who is the protagonist of this story. In 1616, he published his book about nature's decay and impending death, The Fall of Man or the Corruption of Nature. It has been called the most complete expression of what is supposed to have been a very popular and widespread belief at the time, namely that nature was ill, that she was dying, and that her end was near. And the signs were very clear: floods, pests, failed harvests, diseases, ice-cold winters. Think of the Breughel paintings, like this one. There were a lot of winter landscapes because the sun was really diminishing. But 13 years later, after he published it, 13 years later, after having been promoted to Bishop of Gloucester, Goodman excused himself for the work. It was not worthy of a bishop. Today, The Fall of Man or the Corruption of Nature is mostly known through its rebuttal. Where is this? Oh, I took it out. I lost the slide. So the rebuttal is George Hakewill's work, An Apologie for the Providence of God in the Government of the World, which appeared in 1627, so roughly 10 years later. Now, towards the end of his life, in the 1650s, Bishop Goodman was more often called Bishop Badman, for he had become a miserable, impoverished old piece of confusion, as is described by Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century biographer of Oliver Cromwell, who was Lord Protector of England during its short period of Commonwealth in the middle of the 17th century. And why Goodman shows up there is because he dedicated his last work in his life to Cromwell, asking for some financial support, or at least for a hearing of his case. Because indeed, Goodman has lost most of his possessions as a result of the many sequestrations that accompanied the abolishment of the episcopacy and the church courts in the years before. England had just seen two civil wars, parliamentarians opposing royalists, with the execution of Charles I in 1649 as the concluding event. And many of the established clergy, especially the bishops, had been on the side of the king. And since the 1640s, Parliament had tried to restrict the power of the bishops. Now, Goodman's own biographer, who wrote in the 20th century, Geoffrey Soden, Soden wrote how this legend of Bishop Badman, that was repeated throughout historiography, stems from a bias against those individuals who foolishly resisted the inevitable and attempted to stem the tide of progress. Soden's interest in Goodman comes from the fact that he was the only bishop of an English see since the Reformation that died in Roman obedience. Because indeed, Goodman had become ecclesiastically suspect as a papist already in the 1620s, because of his remarks on the real suspect as a papist already in the 1620s, because of his remarks on the real presence in the Eucharist, which was a Catholic dogma that was contested by the Protestant reformers. And in a time that was growing animosity towards the episcopacy, Goodman was thus doomed to receive a bad reputation. And indeed, in his will, he confessed his final faith to the Catholic Church. But back to 1616, when he wrote The Fall of Man. He was only 33 then, and merely a priest and chaplain to Queen Anne. The Fall of Man is an enlargement of a sermon he preached at the Queen's chapel, and it is dedicated also to the Queen. So 11 years later, George Hakewill published his An Apologie for the Power and Providence of God in the Government of the World. He proposed it as an examination of this common error that was spread all over England, which is the belief in nature's perpetual and universal decay. Hakewill was known for his strong Calvinist position, and he was appointed as a chaplain to Prince Charles in 1612. He saw himself in the book as walking in an untrodden path. According to him, the error of nature's decay arose out of the fact that nature was not considered as a whole. So what we might think of as decay only presents itself as decay to us because we don't see it as part of a bigger harmony. If you would zoom out, as it were, you would see that nature was always in balance. So for example, Goodman will give examples of how people grow old and die and get ill, and that is a sign of the corruption of their nature. And then Hakewill says, yeah, but the individual person might grow old, ill and die, but the human race as a whole does not deteriorate. And he repeats this strategy a lot. Now, the Apology was republished in 1630 and then again in 1635, which suggests that it was a popular book. And the most important change in the last edition is its inclusion of an extra book, Book 5, which is an account of the correspondence between Hakewill and Goodman. It is edited by Hakewill and formatted as, in italics, short arguments by Godfrey Goodman, and then longer replies by George Hakewill. Now, this book, which is like 200 pages, becomes what is then later known as the controversy over the decay of nature in the 17th century. There is no evidence that Hakewill's first book was already directly addressed at Goodman. And that's important to note since common references to the debate pretend as if Hakewill was responding to Goodman and that it was Hakewill who was the cause of the controversy, while actually it was Goodman who, after reading Hakewill's book, reached out to Hakewill and started insisting that their correspondence be added to the republication of the Apology. And why that is interesting is that the moment that Goodman reached out to Hakewill, which there are 2 editorial letters prefaced to the 1635 Apology, the moment that explain a bit how this happened. So the moment that Goodman reached out to Hakewill must have been around 1629, so right before the second publication of the Apology. And that is the same year as Goodman's Fall of Man also came out again. It only came out once, and it was actually a reissue, not a republication of the 1616 version. And in that reissue, there is a letter addressed from one RP to the stationer. And in that letter, there is another letter described, namely Goodman's letter that he wrote to this RP, in which Goodman takes distance from the Fall of Man. So he basically says, yes, you have my consent to republish it, but I will not insist on doing it. And I also ask you to take my name off it. So here he even says that he barely remembers that he ever wrote this pamphlet. And it is also in this letter that he calls it a work not worthy of a bishop. Now, so what is curious is that this happens at the same time as he reaches out to Hakewill and insists that his arguments are included in the republication of the Apology. So what is going on? Why is he giving these 2 different sentiments about the work? Well, in the same year, also 1629, King Charles I had dissolved Parliament after years of growing tension and distrust between the king and Parliament, not to summon it again for 11 years. It had come to a breaking point in 1629 as Parliament was criticizing Charles for his wasteful spending in the Spanish War and his allowance of papist influences in the Church of England. Now, from the 13th century, when Parliament was first brought into existence, until the 17th century, the English Parliament was a body that did not have an ongoing function. So it was summoned and dissolved by the monarch when in need of taxes. When a sovereign wanted to collect taxes, without summoning a parliament first, the landed gentry could simply refuse to go and collect taxes. So Parliament used this power to submit bills that were in their favor. So it was a bit of negotiation between the power of Parliament and the power of the king. And in 1629, this balance was failing and Parliament was dissolved without coming to an agreement. And so Charles' dissolution of the Parliament signified the decision to rule alone without resolving the tensions with Parliament. This personal rule would then last until 1640, when Charles I almost went bankrupt after spending too much money on the bishops' war with Scotland. And right before its dissolution in 1629, on the 25th of February, Parliament had made a statement following upon what had been said during the previous session regarding the great dangers threatening the church and state by diverse courses and practices tending to the change and innovation of religion. The statement comprised an enumeration of all these dangers, which in fact were all examples of this one danger, popery, that was not punished. And it is here that the name and the sermons of Godfrey Goodman also appear. And his name comes up a bit further again in these documents in a list of papists that were obtaining places of trust and authority. So it is clear that towards the end of the 1620s, Goodman's words were under scrutiny by a parliament that was gaining power against the will of the king. Now, this is actually a bit all the historical data that can be found on the case. And there is a fact about the controversy between Goodman and Hakewill that makes its case stranger than it otherwise would be, and that is its own marginality or peripherality. I arrived at the controversy years ago through a paper called Science, Progress and the End of the Modern World, published in '92 by Chris Lewis. The paper tackles what the author calls an ecological apocalypticism that grew out of the fear of 16th and 17th century Christian and cultural critics that human domination of nature would cause the decay and death of the natural world. And the paper traces back the apocalyptic tone of recent climate scientists' warnings about climate change to medieval Europe, when problems such as pollution, overpopulation, deforestation, poverty, and famine reinforced an idea of nature's decay. Ever since the dawn of modernity, when nature died, to paraphrase Carolyn Merchant's pivotal work, The Death of Nature, which describes how the scientific revolution killed nature by imagining her as dead matter instead of a living organism. So ever since the dawn of modernity, according to Lewis, critics of progress have returned to the fear that the human interference with the balance and order of nature could cause the decay and death of the natural world and the apocalypse. Now, since the 1980s, so since about the time that The Death of Nature was published, there is a slowly growing interest in the Goodman-Hakewill controversy. However, this interest is always expressed as an interest in the texts from Goodman and Hakewill as an example of a supposedly evident fact that the 17th century was concerned with the possible imminent death of nature. Goodman and Hakewill are introduced as illustrations of what is called then the basic parameters of a debate that existed in this time in Western Europe. So when I encountered these phrasings in Lewis' paper, I became very curious for what the debate was actually about, and I decided to research it for my dissertation. But the longer I searched, the more that debate started to disappear. It seemed to me, or it seems to me now, that this book 5 of the Apology, of the 1635 Apology, has become, throughout the second half of the 20th century, a sort of signpost, pointing to a historically delineated object known as a controversy over the decay of nature in the 17th century. And that pointing happens unproblematically. The 17th century controversy over nature's decay is an uncontested epistemic object. It is curious how little disagreement there has been on the correct interpretation of Goodman and Hakewill's works, while they are supposed to be epitomizing a very popular and widespread belief and its rebuttal, that disposing of one more naive pre-modern belief already in the second half of the 17th century came to be inscribed in the history of that otherwise very contested epistemic object, the scientific revolution. So what I did is I collected an archive of all the references to Goodman and Hakewill and their controversy through JSTOR and Google Scholar. It's possible to do that exhaustively. It's not a very large archive. It's also not very small. But there's only a handful of texts that, like literally 2 books and 3-4 papers, that have engaged fully with the controversy and try to interpret it rather than using it as an illustration of something else. In all of my archive, there is never a statement that resembles anything like, I disagree with how scholar X has interpreted the Goodman-Hakewill controversy. Now, the significance of the Goodman-Hakewill controversy changed as drastically as if the tone of the histories narrating early modern England's progress or awakening into modernity. But scholars writing in the early 2000s cite the interpretations of Goodman-Hakewill controversy given by scholars writing in the 1920s or 1930s as if there is no problem with those interpretations. And that's not because they wouldn't agree with the tone or meaning of these interpretations, but because it seems that the controversy between Goodman and Hakewill itself is, as I said before, an uncontested epistemic historical object. It's as if you can grasp it as a whole, take it out of one history, put it into another history, and nothing happens with the case itself. So after I first encountered the Goodman-Hakewill controversy, I wanted to ask what happened. What happened such that this controversy took place? What happened that Hakewill saw himself as going against the grain? What happened that this belief was so popular and widespread that it could be refuted in only 20 years? what type of proof was able to produce that change, that transformation. Like for the Copernican revolution to take place, many actors in many places needed to make many things happen, but the rebuttal of nature's decay happened in an instant between two men, actually in 1/5 part of one book only. So the attempt of my research was to reconstruct what else happened outside of that 5th part of that book, such that it was given the power to do what it supposedly did. But the peripherality of Goodman and Hakequill's controversy in history writings in the 20th century mirrors the peripherality of the subject of nature's decay in their own lives, in their own time. Although the decay of nature was indeed frequently used as a trope, there is actually no evidence of philosophers or other writers seriously engaging with it as something of intellectual concern, as a fact that needed proof or rebuttal or elaboration or interpretation. There is no evidence that Goodman or Hakewill engaged further with each other, or even with the question of nature's decay itself after their exchange in 1635. There's little evidence of their controversy having affected the people around them, despite mentionings of the supposed popularity of their texts. There is actually little evidence of a belief in nature's decay having affected life in early 17th century England at all. So this left me obviously with a problem. What was my research then about? Now in 1653, in the book dedicated to Cromwell, Goodman gave his own interpretation of the meaning of the fall of man. In the book, The Two Great Mysteries of Christian Religion, which Cromwell's biographer described as some unreadable semi-popish jargon about the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Now, in this work, Goodman took a case against the Socinians, or Socinians, I actually don't know how to pronounce it, one of the many radicalized religious sects during the Commonwealth. They were defined dogmatically by a rejection of the Trinity, a rejection of the fall and of original sin. Marxist historian Christopher Hill related how in that same year, 1653, John Owen was commissioned by the Council of State to refute Socinianism, and he expressed, "There is not a city, a town, scarce a village wherein some of this poison is not poured forth." And in his dedication to Cromwell, Goodman sets forth his problems with the Socinians. 50 years since, or thereabouts, the name of Socinians and Socinians in Italy first began to be known. They are a sect so carried away with their own fancies under the pretense and color of adhering to their own natural reason that they deny the mysteries of our Christian faith and religion, which are indeed above reason, beyond the reach of reason, but no way contrary to reason. And then he relates a little bit later that for about 45 years since, I had a public disputation against them. And not resting there, I did resolve to examine every mystery of faith and every miracle wrought in confirmation of those mysteries. For so it pleased God, that works above natural power, should witness the truth of words above natural knowledge, according to the rules of philosophy. And I began with the first, proving the fall of Adam from paradise by natural reason. And about 40 years since, I set forth a book to that purpose. And although I say it, it had then the approbation and encouragement of those whom it seemed to be the most learned man, as Bishop Andrews, Bishop overall. So this book that he refers to, that he wrote 40 years ago, is The Fall of Man. So according to himself, or at least according to his older self, we should read it as a tract against Socinianism and the rejection of the reality of the fall and the Trinity. However, nowhere in the 400 plus pages of The Fall of Man is the word Socinianism or Socinius ever mentioned. And if you look at the history of Socinianism and how it entered into England, it is actually very improbable that Goodman would already have heard about it in 1616. But it is true that Goodman already in the 1620s was concerned with these questions that were so triggered by the Socinians, namely the reality of some Christian dogmatic events such as the fall, but also the real sacrifice during the Eucharist, or the real presence of Christ's body during the Eucharist. And Socinianism, like many of the other radicalized Protestant sects, took problem with the historicity or the reality of the sacraments, such as the Eucharist, and events such as the fall. So one of the fundamental theological issues of that time was how to read these sacraments. Are they real happenings in the world? Does the Spirit of God actually descend into the institution, like the marriage, the Eucharist, and change something in the world in that moment? Or are these moments symbolic remembrances of something that really happened in the past? But is there nothing really happening in the present when we do these things? When we consume the host, are we eating Jesus, or are we commemorating Jesus by eating bread? The Catholic position was termed the doctrine of transubstantiation, which means indeed that the bread literally effectively changed substance during the Eucharist and became somehow the body of Christ. There's evidence that George Hakewill as well was busy with these theological questions and took a position opposite of Godfrey Goodman's position. He published in 1641 a tract called A Dissertation with Dr. Helen, touching the pretended sacrifice in the Eucharist. And the question in that book is whether the Eucharist be a sacrifice properly so termed, and that according to the doctrine and practice of the Church of England now in force. And he picked a controversy in this book with this Dr. Helen, who believed that indeed the Eucharist was a real sacrifice, which according to Hakewill was not possible within the Anglican position because it would mean also holding the doctrine of transubstantiation, which was a Catholic doctrine. Without transubstantiation, there is no real sacrifice because a sacrifice needs a body sacrificed. So as I said, it became increasingly difficult over the time of my writing my thesis to understand how to introduce the controversy between Goodman and Hakewill. And that is not only because of my own changing sentiment about the case, taking distance from my original ecological motivations for finding it interesting, which I started to find naive and not historically accurate. I was looking too much for myself. But the difficulty in introduction is also because it became increasingly difficult to understand where to place the subject of that controversy as an object of historic knowledge. What was the reality of that controversy? In between Breughel paintings and the Eucharist, what was it actually about? Just 1 year before the publication of The Fall of Man, in the winter of 1614-15, there was what is now known as the Great Snow in England. The Archbishop of York recorded 7 weeks of frost and snow. And since it was coined as a term by Francois Matthews in 1939, geologists and historians speak of the Little Ice Age, which is a period of regional cooling stretching from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And since the 2000s, within this period, another specific cooling phase from 1560 to 1630 has received the name Grindelwald fluctuation after a Swiss glacier that expanded during this period. And so historians have recently laid bare how for decades the weather in England was not just cold, but highly erratic, resulting in a series of extremely destructive weather events. And so some years ago, what is called the Bristol Chronicles were made accessible, and they are very elaborate diaries written by English priests or English, not so important people who kept journals, and they have been analyzed in a paper called Weird Weather in Bristol during the Grindelwald fluctuation. And these chronicles show indeed that people noted the irregularity of the weather in their own time. Now, some have connected the myriad of social and political crises that characterized the 16th and 17th century in Europe to the Little Ice Age, a shift of climate that provoked material pressures leading to violent responses, which on their turn led to the dawn of the modern world. So more recently, the interest in the historical problem of the Little Ice Age has grown. But now what happens here since the early 2000s, through these papers that are written after the appearance and solidification of epistemic objects such as the Grindelwald fluctuation, the Little Ice Age, the Anthropocene, what appears there is a late medieval or early modern subject who, by expressing nature's decay, knew something about their world. Compare that to how Goodman and Hakewill first appeared in 20th century historiography in Richard Foster Jones' paper that he later developed into the famous book Ancients and Moderns. Man loves to persecute himself. The slightest chance to make himself miserable, he will probably succeed. No matter how ill-founded the fear, how far-fetched the supposition, if the world can reason itself into terror, it will do so. Yet I think there has hardly been in the history of civilization a clearer instance of borrowed trouble and pursued gloom than occurred in a generation that witnessed Spencer, Bacon, and Shakespeare. So this paper was later elaborated into the Ancients and Moderns in 1936, which is up until now the second most cited source on Goodman and Hakewill. And here's the opening paragraph of the first most cited source and also the only monograph on the controversy, which is Victor Harris's All Coherence Gone from 1949. Recurrent in man's intellectual history is a suspicion or a fear, and often a philosophical conviction that his world is disintegrating. For this belief, he finds many reasons. The race of man seems to grow feebler, society more confused, and all nature old and weary. This sensible decay of the universe, the corruption of plants or creatures or of the heavens themselves, is confirmed by the unresolved conflicts within man's mind. He has before him the tragic disparity between the ailing world he lives in and an ideal world which he envisages. Old men remember happier days of their youth. Legend cherishes the dream of a golden or heroic age, of an era of giants or miracles, of a Garden of Eden untouched by sin or death. This example of the old man remembering happier days is also used by George Hakewill to refute the decay of nature as an illusion. But so now what happens when I am trying to write about this case is that the ecological crisis, as it started to be expressed in literature since the 1980s, it gave the Goodman-Hakewill controversy a sort of reality back that it lacked before, or that it lacked at least since Hakewill successfully turned nature's decay into an illusion, or as Richard Foster Jones called it, a hallucination. The weather reports, as discovered in the Bristol Chronicles, are what make it real again. However, introducing Goodman and Hakewill through a Breughel painting, as I did, or through the diary entries and the Little Ice Age, feels like a lie or a deception as well. Because Goodman and Hakewill, they do refer to the weather. Goodman talks about the sun diminishing in heat, dying out, and there were actually some actual controversies about the distance of the sun and if it had changed since the beginning of the world or not. But it does not form the core of their arguments. It is one illustration of nature's decay. It is not the convincing argument or the main argument that they use. Goodman is as concerned with the weather as he is with the relative merits of the ancients and the moderns, as he is with the correct interpretation of the existence of worms. So the Little Ice Age, through reading these Bristol Chronicles, becomes the possible reality, is constructed epistemically as a possible reality that is lurking behind the facts as they are described in these diary entries or by Goodman. But there is another possible reality lurking behind these facts. Everything froze and became hard. This is one diary entry in the Bristol Chronicles. It hailed, it snowed, and cutting winds were whistling from All Souls' Day to now, March. The good Lord, we learned from this, wants to show us thus how much we have gone astray, but the people did not change and behaved as if they were his enemies. So writing here in his diary in the 1570s is Wouter Jacobson, a Catholic monk who had fled to Amsterdam to escape persecution in his monastery in Gouda. He writes a bit later, God has abandoned us. The grace of the Holy Sacraments was taken from us. And here we see how he interpreted the cold like he interpreted the Protestant rebellion as a sign of God's retreat from the world. Now, the paper on weird weather in Bristol comments on these sort of fragments. Taken in isolation, it would be easy to dismiss such statements as hyperbolic. The colorful language and providentialism of Jacobean news writers might make the modern reader suspect exaggeration. Yet, the author's observations should not be dismissed just because they interpreted these events as evidence of God's wrath within a sinful world. Both climate science and environmental history point to the Grindelwald fluctuation being an age of extreme weather. In these type of paragraphs, the chronicle and diary entries are made to point to two things. First, that something really happened to the weather in the 16th, 17th century, and that the contemporaries were aware of this, knew something about this, even though they expressed it with superstitious concepts. Now, historians collaborated with scientists, with natural scientists, to fact check the reality behind these diary entries. They use methods such as methods that rely on paleo-environmental evidence retrieved from stratified deposits such as ice cores and marine and lake sediments. And as we see here in this paper, it's published in the journal Weather, and it is a collaboration between the history department and the paleoclimate research group. But this reality that is produced in this way by historians collaborating with natural scientists was obviously not the reality that Goodman was talking about when he was talking about nature's decay. And therefore, one of the main leading questions of my thesis has become, did Godfrey Goodman really believe in nature's decay? The recent ecological awakening, and specifically the creation of the Little Ice Age, or LIA, and the Grindelwald fluctuation have made this question possible, because an unsettling reality has been given back to Goodman's texts that it had completely lost before. So did Godfrey Goodman really believe in nature's decay? And one way in which to approach that question is through understanding how nature's decay throughout the ages has been produced as an epistemic object, as something that can be the subject of belief or knowledge. And for sure, in the 16th, 17th century itself, it seemed mostly confined to theological spaces of discourse, like priests writing sermons. In that sense, it was not something that was known at the time. But then in the second half of the 17th century already, it became very shortly part of something that we would say is something that knows, namely in the second half of the 17th century, the early defenders of the Royal Society, which was the first experimental natural philosophical society that was erected in the 1660s in England. Hakewill was quoted by some of these prominent new philosophers, such as Henry Power and John Webster, when they discussed the type of resistance and censor the new philosophers had met with when they were going against the stream of common opinion. And Hakewill is mentioned as one example of someone who had to suffer censor. So here we see John Webster's The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft from 1677, talking about Hakewill, who has for once and for all proved that nature's decay is an illusion. And a bit further, in like 2 pages further, he switches to talking about René Descartes, who suffered the same fate. So here we have Hakewill, who is put next to René Descartes in a list of someone who accomplished something. But then Goodman and Hakewill disappeared. There is a link between John Milton and the question of decay. So once in the 19th century, in a work on John Milton, Hakewill comes up, but it's a very short reference. And then it's the beginning of the 20th century only that they really resurface into historiography. And as I said, the first one to introduce him really back on the stage was Richard Foster Jones. Now, what's interesting there is that they re-entered the 20th century through literary studies. And it is very probable that Jones found out about Hakewill through this Milton connection. Richard Foster Jones was indeed a literary scholar, taking his interest from Swift. So this first paper on the Battle of the Books was a study of the satire that Jonathan Swift wrote in the beginning of the 18th century where there is a library depicted where books of the ancients and books of the moderns start fighting each other. And Jones proposed to trace the origin of this trope of the battle between the ancients and the moderns, but a literary battle, actually. And next to Jones, we have John Harris with All Coherence Gone. Now, as the title already makes clear, Harris also took his interest from a literary entry. All Coherence Gone is a reference to John Donne's famous poem, which talks about a sick world that is dying. The sick world, ye that ye putrefied, since she, thy intrinsic balm and thy preservative can never be renewed, thou never live. I, since no man can make thee live, will try what we may gain by thy anatomy, corrupt and mortal in thy purest parts. And Donne talks also about the new philosophy calling all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new, they see that this is crumbled out again to its atomies, all in pieces, all coherence gone. So different literary scholars have made a connection between Donne's Anatomy and Goodman's Fall of Man, either assuming direct influence or just citing both close to each other as prime examples of the type of melancholy that characterized early 17th century England. So the literary scholar George Williamson, for example, spoke of the metaphysical shudder that he was interested in Donne. Like, where does this metaphysical shudder comes from? And he related it to the observation of phenomena that deeply disturbed the sense of coherence and belonging in the 17th century, such as the appearance of a new star in 1572 in the constellation of Cassiopeia, and another one in 1604. These observations disrupted the order as it was known through astronomical study thus far, because, as you might know, the Aristotelian framework in natural philosophy said that all change happened under the moon in the sublunar, and that the supralunar was exempt from any type of change of mutability. And so these observations triggered questions to the correctness of this image, and triggered the question: is our theory wrong, or is the world changing? Then you had a few years later Galileo publishing his observations of spots on the moon, which by Goodman were interpreted as age spots. I don't know how you say that in English, like that appear on the skin with older people. So all these phenomena were signs of...
That's the interpretation of Goodman.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So these phenomena were signs of mutability and change in the heavens that were heretofore considered eternal and immutable. And Donne, as we see in these verses, related this disorder to the feeling of the world being done. So in 1935, we have this introduction of the idea of the metaphysical shudder in 17th century England. How Victor Harris in All Coherence Gone interprets it. He talks about the Goodman-Hakewill controversy as a clash between two different attitudes towards the world, a pessimistic attitude versus an optimistic attitude. And he credits Hakewill as having enabled the optimistic attitude by denying the decay inherent in the order of nature. Victor Harris was also a literary scholar. But then what is interesting is to look at the republication of the Ancients and Moderns book. So it was first published in 1936, then in 1961 it is republished, and its subtitle changes from The Background of the Battle of the Books, which was also the title of his 1920 paper, to A Study of the Rise of the Scientific Movement in 17th Century England. And so Jones says in the foreword that this new title is a bit more correct to the content of the book. That so originally the work was the outgrowth of a previous study of the controversy between the upholders of antiquity and those of modernity in the 17th century, evidence of which fact is seen in its first title, and subtitles. Since the book is now rather closely identified with the title, it seems best to retain it, but the subtitle, together with certain passages in the text, has been changed to conform more closely to the nature of the study, the scope of which in the process of its first composition expanded almost unconsciously to include more elements in the scientific movement than were indicated on the title page. And it is actually symbolically, significantly, through this republication that the Goodman-Hakewill controversy becomes part of the history of science. 2 years later, in 1967, it appears for the first time in a work written by a scientist, Clarence Glacken, who wrote Traces on the Rhodian Shore, Nature and Culture in Western Thought from Ancient Times to the End of the 18th Century. And he talks about this figure of speech, of the dispute between the ancients and moderns. It is that of the modern knowing more than the ancient, because even if he is only a dwarf, he is standing on the shoulders of a giant. The figure of speech, however, has been ascribed by John of Salisbury to Bernard de Chartres in the 12th century. Perhaps it goes back even further. But then he writes, "We are not directly concerned with the bearing of this much-studied quarrel on the idea of progress, but with certain other ideas which were used as arguments in the quarrel itself. It involved a conflict between two conceptions of nature, a nature constant in its operations or a nature decaying in time, like a living organism. The latter supported, as Hakewill showed, by a potpourri of miscellaneous evidence of deterioration in nature." So we have actually for the first time here in 1967 that nature reappears as a reality that this controversy was actually about. But Glacken has a very Whiggish, let's say, interpretation, which he takes from Jones, where he calls Hakequill's book as a book that bears the stamp of greatness, that successfully gets rid of a dumb illusion, as expressed by Goodman. And so the sentence I find interesting here is, so the book shows how urgent was the need to believe in the constancy of nature and in the regular operation of its laws, if any forward-looking attitude toward nature, science, and civilization was to be achieved. So the conception of nature becomes here instrumentalized for the necessity of the belief in progress. How could man and the civilizations he had created be expected to progressively improve if the nature which supported him and then was becoming weaker day by day? Now, even when the Goodman-Hakewill controversy escapes these boundaries of literary studies and becomes part of the history of science or the history of the study of nature, it is remarkable how nature fails to completely re-enter the controversy again. The aboutness of the controversy is entirely understood as a matter of an attitude, an intellectual attitude towards an otherwise evidently stable nature. And on the one hand, it can be understood as a consequence of the banality of history. When Jones first included a reference to Goodman and Hakewill, he did so in a story that was concerned with a literary battle on the merits of ancients and moderns. And he explicitly stated the limitations of his discussion. So on Goodman, for example, he says there is only 3 out of the 450 pages, which is actually concerned with this question of the ancients and the moderns and their mental powers. And on Hakewill, he also wrote, "Since the progress of the controversy confined the arena entirely to man's mental power and accomplishment, we are concerned chiefly with that portion of the third part of Hakewill's book that treats of man's arts and wits." Now, Jones became the main authority on the Goodman-Hakewill case up until now, actually. But Jones changed the meaning of his ancients and moderns in the republication in the 60s, making Goodman and Hakewill part of the history of science, despite the clear limitation he himself chose and was justified to choose. But this last sentence of Jones also hints at a maybe less banal truth of why nature fails to reappear in the controversy, namely George Hakewill's historic success itself. It was Hakewill's historic success to make nature disappear out of the belief in nature's decay. Now, on multiple occasions, he shows how it is an illusion that is the result of a certain attitude towards life, an attitude towards nature. He repeated that we shouldn't impute our own shortcomings to nature's decay or to the world's decay, but to ourselves. Let us not cast our own deficiencies in regard of the world's decay, but upon our own sloth. If we come short of them in virtue, let us not impute it to the declination of the world, but to the malice and faintness of our own wills. If we feel the scourges of God upon our own land by mortality, famine, unseasonable weather, or the like, let us not teach the people that they are occasioned by the world's old age, and thereby call into question the providence or power or wisdom or justice or goodness of the maker thereof, but by their and our sins, which is doubtless both a truer and more profitable doctrine, and withal more consonant to the sermons of Christ and his apostles and the prophets and God in like cases. So the success of Hakewill's text is that nature's decay becomes an illusion. So whatever it tells us something about ourselves and not about nature. And in that type of history, Hakewill also becomes very closely affiliated with Francis Bacon as one of the necessary spirits that took away the illusions that stood in the way of a progressive outlook on nature and science. So Jones does that already in 1920. Then I have included one more random example of how Hakewill and Bacon are often put together in the same sentence. And very interesting is especially Christopher Hill's history. He has a very positive appraisal of the English Revolution as the first surge of democracy in England. And he calls Hakewill an activist. Whereas he calls an activist with a Baconian emphasis. Whereas he calls Bishop Goodman an extreme conservative. Goodman being so upset by the geographical discoveries, the new astronomy and the new morality that he thought they could only presage the destruction of the world. But so then, after the 60s and especially after the 80s, a new type of epistemic object is produced with this question of nature's decay. And so, for example, in this Lewis paper where I first encountered it, he writes, the death of nature and the end of the modern industrial civilization may be metaphors, describing the imminent collapse of the modern worldview and outlining new structures for organizing human society and its relationship to the natural world. And I got a bit stuck on this idea of a metaphor. What does it mean to call it a metaphor? And already in 1959, there is this idea that this controversy over nature's decay was a subconscious translation of an experience of a world ending at the time. Oh, well, that's too early. And what I'm working a bit on now is the fact that this metaphor idea actually is already present in the type of poetry that tackled this idea of nature's decay, for example, in John Donne, because John Donne's poetry has been called already in its own time, and then it was very derogatory, metaphysical poetry, in the same way that metaphysics received a bad reputation. It is in the beginning of the 20th century by T.S. Eliot that this idea of the metaphysical poetry of Donne and some other poets at the time got a positive reappraisal. And the key characteristic of his metaphysical poetry is supposed to be that it used very elaborate metaphors or conceits. And Donne's Decay of Nature is one famous example. So the verses that I quoted just now come from a poem that is called An Anatomy of the World, First Anniversary, in which he compared the death of Elizabeth Drury, which was the daughter of his patron, to the death of the world. So what is this poem actually really about? Is it about the death of a person or is it the death of the world? What is metaphor for what in this poem? And it is this confusion that was very negatively regarded until the beginning of the 20th century when T.S. Eliot, after the First World War, found emotional recognition in this poetry. And so my thesis is concerned with the status of Goodman's decaying nature or Donne's world spent as an object of epistemic belief. And the fact that Donne's poetry received already in his own time the label metaphysical also is an example of how legitimacy is given to that question or the question whether Don was making claims about the state of the world when he was writing this poetry about nature's decay. And let me end on something funny to illustrate also this the tricky epistemic status of metaphors in general. In 2019, I don't know if there's people here that read Dutch. I will just translate, but there was a controversy. It was in the Flemish media, but I imagine it was also in the Dutch media and also in the German media. I don't know if it was also in French media. There was a controversy because Greta Thunberg's mom had published a biography of Greta Thunberg, in which at some point there is an anecdote of how Greta and her classmates were watching a movie about climate change. And it is described how all classmates were affected, but soon after the movie was over, everyone went on with their life, eating hamburgers and talking about trips to New York. And Greta was not able to go back to normal life. And then it is described how Greta saw what the rest of us did not want to see. It was as if she could see our CO2 emissions with her naked eye, the invisible, colorless, scentless, soundless abyss that our generation has chosen to ignore. And so this part of the biography was published in advance in a German newspaper, and then it was picked up by media, other media. And in a Flemish newspaper, Het Laatste Nieuws, it was written, mother of Greta Thunberg, my daughter can see CO2 with her bare eyes. The article goes on to say that Greta Thunberg was diagnosed as a child with obsessive-compulsive disorder and Asperger syndrome, like her younger sister Beata, and that the activist also has a photographic memory, and that apart from that, she has another gift, according to her mom, which is that she can see what others can't see. She can see carbon dioxide with her bare eyes. She sees it coming out of chimneys and change the atmosphere into a garbage dump. Then our current Prime Minister, Bart De Wever, not yet Prime Minister, reacted in an interview. Greta Thunberg has been invited by the European Commission and will maybe get the Nobel Prize. That little girl has a high Jeanne d'Arc nature. Yeah, daar waren ook kosten aan. There were a lot of costs on Jeanne d'Arc too. Jeanne d'Arc thought she saw our Lord. Greta sees CO2 fumes. The Flemish broadcaster, the VRT, went on to ask a toxicologist, Jan Tijdgat, is it possible to see CO2? Toxicologist Jan Tijdgat replies very shortly, carbon dioxide is a colorless and odorless gas. You really can't see that. A day later, the newspapers went on to correct themselves. Fake news. Greta Thunberg can really see CO2. They had reached out to the mom of Greta Thunberg to ask if it was really true that Greta Thunberg could see CO2 with her bare eyes. Greta's mom had reacted very shortly, no, it was just a metaphor. Now, what is this weird confusion between the literal and the metaphorical? What happened here? If we want to assume that all journalists of these established and sometimes really serious newspaper did not all collectively go mad for a day, then what happened there? I promised in my abstract that the overview of how the 17th century controversy over nature's decay became known in the 20th century, that this overview can reveal something of what was at stake in the controversy that has remained unrevealed until now. And I started with the invocation of Michel de Certeau as a stubborn historian, whose value lies in the fact that he was not so easily satisfied. Historical accuracy is a value that is not easy to cherish. It is governed, kept, defined through institutions whose legitimacy as knowledge producers is in doubt. But throughout this process of writing the PhD thesis, that process that is supposed to transform me from someone who speaks into someone who speaks credibly, I've come to appreciate the paradoxes and impossibilities that the cherishing of historical accuracy brings. It brings a stubbornness, I believe, to search for something that always eludes our grasp, but a stubbornness also to allow it always to escape. And the 17th century decay of nature, I think, can be reconstructed as a monstrous and ghostly epistemic object. And in the same way that the 17th century is known to have been obsessed with the monstrous, I think it is interesting to try and understand this nature's decay as a monstrous object as well. Now, monstrous objects are things that confuse borders, that upset the order of the world as it was known. And nature's 17th century decay is monstrous, I think, because whenever I try to grasp it and define it or introduce it through a type of knowledge or a type of discipline, I feel that it keeps transgressing the borders. I try to capture it as a literary object, it becomes metaphysical poetry. I try to capture it in weather reports, and it becomes a sign of God's providence. It is also ghostly because whenever nature's 17th century decay has appeared in history, both in 17th century, in the supposed controversy itself, as in the 20th century, I feel like it leaves a decay of nature-shaped hole. It seems that no one, even Goodman and Hakewill themselves, were really talking about nature's decay when they were talking about nature's decay. Well, I will end on that sentence.
Thank you. I think we're going to have a little coffee break, and then we come back for a round of questions or comments. Thanks. Okay, nice. Thanks. I have questions, but let's open the floor to everyone else first. Yeah.
Maybe a lighter question to begin. What is the biggest challenge for you coming from a philosophical point of view and information to a more historical point of view? And maybe what was the trigger that really made you feel like, okay, right now I'm doing more history, even though it's blurred too. Yeah.
I think the moment that I really had to or chose to engage with history as a discipline was because I made a short detour into this book, Carolyn Merchant's The Death of Nature. I found it very interesting, but then I started reading critiques on it, so it has really been smashed to pieces in the 90s, 2000s. And something quite interesting happened that she wrote like this 200-page book, a very vague sketch of like quite a lot of people in 16th, 17th century to trace a shift from nature as a living being to nature as a machine. And she wrote 3 pages on Francis Bacon, and some Bacon scholars were like really, really pissed off at her because she claims that Bacon violated nature. And she makes the argument that in Bacon's time, there were a lot of restrictions on how you should deal with nature, like ethical, like there were stories, myths on the relation between man and nature, that nature has borders that you shouldn't transgress. And she proposes, well, Bacon proposed to transgress these borders. So
He's explicitly saying we should rape nature.
Well, he isn't.
Okay.
So that, I mean, and this is exactly was what intrigued me is that, so Merchant.
It's a bad translation.
But so this is what it's. Well, he says we should penetrate nature's holes. And there is a lot of imagery that if you put it together, you get the image of rape. But it's not that he uses the word rape. And feminist historians coming after Merchant, so this Merchant triggered this, feminist historians started taking this and doing the more detailed research. Then you have Evelyn Fox Keller and 2 others who then started saying Bacon said we should rape nature. They used then, but then, so what happens in the 90s is that a bunch of scholars start looking at the Latin in Bacon, how it's translated, that it was actually Leibniz who was really pissed off at Bacon and started translating him already more violently than he actually wrote. Then you have in 2012 or something, there is like a 30-page paper with what he, like the writer proposes this as a Baconian analysis of the Baconian problem, which is collecting instances of in tables and making like probability state, like blah, 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 like all of this. But the point that the weird thing is that these scholars, I mean, yeah, you've seen this presentation, like they make way more outrageous claims than Merchant does. Like there's one scholar, Brian Vickers, like he was ennobled for his academic achievements in England, like super, super legitimate guy. At some point wrote, it's a bit a Greta Thunberg thing. He wrote, nature is not a woman. She cannot be raped. She cannot be tortured. And Carolyn Merchant, in her work, is doing injustice to man, and this I know by heart, this injustice to men who have been historically excluded from the care of children, but who are equally capable of nurturing crops and taking care. So then they say that Merchant is biased as a historian because she's frustrated. They use the concept of ressentiment. They say like feminist historians of science cannot do accurate historiography because they are filled with resentment. And then he says something like, because of their failed attempt at overthrowing patriarchy. He's even saying that it's failed attempt. Like it's like you're going way wilder than Carolyn Merchant did, based on the facts. Yet, or I was writing about this, that the sort of tragedy is that whenever you would talk about this case, it's very clear, it's just very funny. But if you look at the facts, Merchant's critics won. I collected also references to Merchant's Death of Nature, and she also wrote 2 extra papers to defend her Bacon claims. And these papers I think they have like 1 or 2 citations. The critics, so what happens is that the papers of the critics are cited without reference to the Merchant debate. So they are, in that sense, we could say they are used as neutral epistemic claims about Bacon and what he did to nature. if merchants' claims are referenced, they're always contextualized within the debate. So merchants' historic claims did not escape the context of production, let's say, the debate, but Piesek and Vickers, her main critics, they are cited in introductory works to the history of science. These papers are cited for, there's even examples, and it's very classic, but it's crazy. There are examples where people write, yes, there is some ideas of like Bacon doing violence to nature, see Brian Vickers, blah, 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 blah. So like even to cite merchants' things, like statements, her critics are cited. Whatever. This is when I stumbled upon this, and then I was very intrigued by this thing of historical accuracy, the way that they thought about it, because of the links also with political neutrality. So the idea that merchant is ideologically biased, but then Piesek and Vickers in various moments acknowledge that what is at stake is the ecological crisis and how to tackle it. And then they say, yeah, merchant just thinks that we should do it without science, and we are techno-optimists. So they are even admitting that they are ideologically as biased as merchant is, and yet something is at stake there with the fact that, so my interpretation of that case is that what is so dangerous about merchant is not that she's ideologically biased, because we're also all writing post-1980 and like postmodernism and stuff. The problem is that we should, if we are well-behaved historians, we should try to minimize our bias by doing certain procedures or methods. And what is very scary about merchant is that her subtitle is already acknowledging her bias. So she's like using her bias to produce knowledge instead of trying to lock out the bias, which is what you should do as a historian or something. And then you have the Jenny Bulstrode case, which we also talked, like also that's 2-3 years ago, a historian that claimed that Britain's main technological innovation, that's what it can take credit for in the Industrial Revolution, it was patented by a British man, but that it was actually invented by Black Jamaican slaves and stolen as a technology and then patented in Britain. And there also, it's the same with like Bacon never actually used the word rape, and Jenny Bulstrode also was a little bit too speculative in her claims, but she also acknowledged that she was speculating, but then it's like, then people are really angry that she speculated. So there is something, and she was also like smashed to pieces. But the curious thing there also is that like there is actually only one paper that contradicts her claims, and it is written by a student that there is no trace to find online. And people, and then again, it's about the legitimacy of the university and this and that, but then these people that are so critical of Jenny Bulstrode are basing, and then you get interesting things also in the media. It's then said major Oxford historians debunk the claims by Jenny Bulstrode, blah, blah, blah. But that's a confusion of major Oxford historians being pissed at Jenny Bulstrode and some unknown scholar actually debunking her claim. No one double checking the scholar's work. So it's also like, and then I thought like I find this really fun also to, okay, what does it mean to be like this question to be historical? Like how do I relate myself to that question? Yeah.
Don't be on social media. You will not survive as a scholar.
Yeah, but yeah.
Too depressing.
Yeah.
Well, it's just that it's true that in the history of science, the death of nature has, like you said, not left the conditions of production. But in environmental history, for example, or political ecology, there it's taken as like one of the sort of classics in the discipline. Yeah. And it's taken seriously by the things that it says. So, because there are no Baconians within environmental history, perhaps. But so it depends also on the discipline where, I'm like, but any other questions? Yeah, Alexandre.
I have one, but it's more a historical one. So it's fascinating, this debate that I didn't know, because just later there's a similar debate about the decay of the universe between not between, but there's a lot of actors, but at the time of Newton and Leibniz and all these guys, based on the idea, but the idea is they always talk about the rational God. So, okay, so is a rational God would allow this decay or not? But now this debate, it's much more in between Goodman is really a Catholic, so do you think it's the same debate, or when we go to, okay, the rational God, would the rational God allow or no this decay? We are going much farther than this source, which seems more in the Anglican, Protestant, Catholic fight.
Yeah, but this is a bit a question in the sense that it is, in Goodman's text, it's not a scholastic question. It's not something, it is actually a trope that he uses, and like also the tone of his text is like it's a sermon. You feel like how it's supposed to move you and to touch you. It is actually Hakewill that turns it into a scholastic question. Also because it's funny in these like the sort of Christopher Hill narratives, Hakewill is like the new philosopher who gets rid of all the stupidity and illusions of the late Middle Ages, but it is actually Hakewill who is constantly quoting Aristotle, and like he's really the scholastic of the two. And it is Hakewill also I think he would indeed say like we cannot. So the title of his work is also An Apologie of the Providence and Power of God in the government of the world. So his question is really about governing, like how is the universe governed, and what happens if we allow the idea of actually a gap between a rationalist and perfectly provident God and a nature that is like doing like whatever, or like going a bit here and there. It's like the funny thing with Goodman's text is that it's full of paradoxes, because he's saying like, this decay of nature is obviously not installed in nature by God, because they also have a problem there with the provident God, but it's still installed in nature as a punishment for man's sin. But then at some point he says, who should I accuse? For man himself, he's ordained by nature, by a corrupt nature. So he's like really in this trap of like, I don't know, there's a difference. I don't know so much in what terms this debate is then fought out, but I feel like what happens with, I'm in that sense a bit going towards a more metaphysical or theological reading of what's happening, is that it is indeed, I like more the language of defilement. Like he's really interested in, and he's obsessed with dirt. Yeah. So I feel it's more like in that sense interesting to like. I'm a bit now on the path also of using Certeau's idea on the mystic language and the language that refuses everything. And what does it say about like how is it socially understandable? Like there is a search in mystic speech also in this period in Western Europe, like that there is really a whole. It's also true. Goodman was a conservative, how was it like an impoverished piece of confusion? But I must agree to some extent. But what is weird is that in first instance, when I read it, or also when I let some of my friends read some of the things, it touches us or our generation a lot. So it's like both nonsense what he's writing, but there is, I think I'm trying to capture what it is that it now feels so recognizable in this language.
But but it's not necessarily nonsense if he does not have a notion of a rational God. So you cannot, he cannot know the plans of God. Leibniz, when you read Leibniz and Newton, they are super arrogant because they think, both of them, and they disagree about that they have access to God's reasons.
But actually, I think in that sense, it is Hakewill who emphasizes the difference between the natural and the supernatural. Okay. So he's constantly saying like everything that has to do with beginning, end, or the course of the universe is supernaturally revealed to us. So it is impossible that nature is already telling us anything about the end. And it is Goodman who is saying that God is using nature as a means of revelation also. And Hakewill refuses, also quite often does this thing of like, you cannot confuse the two. Nature is not at all pointing to anything of God.
Okay.
Yeah, so in that sense, but
so he's not even Anglican.
Hakewill is Calvinist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, like the strictness of the supernatural is supernatural, and it cannot. And it is actually, but it's also one of the points of the it is because Bacon and Hakewill are often compared, but it is actually Goodman and Bacon who should be compared, because Bacon also, his whole project starts from the idea that nature is corrupt. And that is a message from God, and that through nature's corruption, God is telling us that we should change nature and turn her into a paradise as she is supposed to be. And Goodman is in that sense a bit saying the same, like, yeah, all of nature's corruption is a message to us, but he's not saying it's a message that we should change nature. He's saying it's a message that nature is going to be soon done and that we have to start looking at God. Yeah.
But one is a minister, the other is a bishop, so it makes sense.
And that, no.
No, but one is a bishop.
Yeah.
It's normal that he won't claim, we should change nature and work to,
Yeah.
we should work on ourselves in priority.
Yeah. We should, convert, transform ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have more of a sort of general context question about this controversy between the ancients and the moderns, because I'm not very familiar with the literature on the topic, but is it only in England that it got so sort of national philosophy flavored? Because, like, for example, my perception of the French debate is like only about literature.
Yeah, so that is actually what Jones' paper was about, his 1920 paper. He is claiming that the debate is mostly known, like, so there is a lot of literature also in the 19th century on the debate in French context, and he's saying, well, if you look in the English context, we see that it got turned into natural philosophy. Okay. Yeah, so indeed. But I haven't, so I'm now just saying Jones would say yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a hand? No.
So another question is also a general question. So you were talking about sort of, at least in this case, they're using this organic metaphor. At least Goodman is using this organic metaphor as saying, look, it's like a living organism. It means it will decline. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious whether, like, how much of the commonplace is to associate organic with decline. Mm-hmm. Because organic is also sort of, development, growth, these kind of things. And I mean, and this, if you look in the 19th century, for some people it will be, the development, the absolute spirit is also an organic metaphor in the sense, but it's very positive directed. I was just curious whether it was around both things, or it was this, idea of opposition between eternal and good and this sort of organic becoming, which is always deteriorating.
Yeah. So I think my response to that would be that the idea that Goodman was using an organic metaphor would be the 1980s interpretation of what was happening. I wouldn't say Goodman was using an organic metaphor to talk about nature. If anything, it was way more in the context of what I said in the beginning, like the question of the correct distribution between eternity and historicity. Would be a more apt way to talk about it. So because the organic as a whole can be eternal as well. Mm-hmm. But this is a bit at stake then between Goodman and Hakewill, that Goodman emphasizes, like any living being, nature also will decay, and that Hakewill then says, but if you zoom out, there is also eternity. But so I think it's more that this organic metaphor is almost instrumentalized to make points about eternity and historicity, and not. But actually, the images he uses are. He calls her a stepmother instead of a mother. So but that's not so much about the organic, but about the relation of care. Goodman says like at some point, but he exclaims a lot. It's really she should rather be called a stepmother instead of a loving mother, something like this. Or he says like, this is also a nice one. She can no longer be accounted as an indifferent judge, but as a partial stepdame, wholly inclining and intending to corruption. So I think it hooks in a bit to this, that I think now that I'm towards the end of the thesis, and also this connection with John Donne, that I am more interested in how he is so obsessed with seeing the dirty everywhere. Because it's also clear that is what Hakewill refuses to do, but Hakewill has indeed something quite clinical to, like, you just zoom out, like it's, there's also this narrative of like the Michel Serres, Brune Latour narrative of taking distance from the earth as also a way of like, that allows natural philosophy to become science, but also allows ecological crisis to happen some centuries later, is that you feel this also a bit in Hakewill, that he's literally saying, like, if you look at it as a whole, which implies a gaze from outside, like looking at, and Goodman is like really like, he's talking about worms and things that are in the dirt and on earth. And this is the connection with, I read this Michel de Certeau, as he has an essay on like language of like the vile, the corrupt, the dirty, like what it's, when it erupts in certain moments in society and what it's like, what it means.
Okay, thanks. I have some clarification question, then a question about your dissertation. But first, I couldn't help but there is this speech in there. But as the sun is setting, a few minutes ago, sat there and was not feeling good in the stomach. And
No.
yeah, just as you were speaking. So I don't know, metaphor or whatnot, but something's happening there.
Not sure what you are trying to convey.
I'm trying to that, you know, you're talking about nature's decay, and I'm saying that as the sun sets and things get darker. So
we should timestamp this image.
So you're the new John Donne.
but no, so first the verification question. At some point I got lost when you were talking about Jones' review. If I understand correctly, you said that he failed for nature to appear.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite get whether that was something that Jones failed to do when he was talking about them, or that was something that Hakewill was trying to do to precisely sort of remove nature from the debate, or I just didn't understand.
Yeah. So both, I think. So so this point about the banalities is like, of course, in Jones' original paper, which actually makes the point that you were referring to, of is showing how in England this literary debate has also roots in quarrels about natural philosophy and to what extent we can know nature. So Jones does that. He very specifically says, like, I am interested in their discussion about the intellectual merits of the ancients and the moderns. So but then this sort of gets repeated to the extent that it took me even quite a long time to understand, like, Jones is talking about natural philosophy, but not about nature. Like this whole debate is reduced to intellectual achievements. Goodman and Hakewill, for the longest part in the 20th century, are understood as people who are talking about what can we do with our mind or something. And it is only at when the ecological crisis appears that there is this appearance of a nostalgia towards the Middle Ages as a time in which it was like this idea of a solidarity with nature and a cosmos as a whole. It's only then that slowly this nature as a decaying body re-enters this discussion of the Goodman-Hakewill controversy. And then my claim was with, like, first there is this banality in the fact that Jones first was talking about the literary debate, then sort of made it into history of science, but didn't redo his interpretation and didn't look at the rest of the text. This is then taken over, but it's also not just that, it's also true that Hakewill himself already, that was his success. It's already in the 17th century that these new philosophers say, like, that was clearly an illusion because people were too pessimistic about their own abilities. So this nature disappears. Actually, Hakewill takes it serious. Hakewill is all the time talking about nature being whole, nature being in balance. But this is never, like, they're only saying that Hakewill was an optimist. But if you're trying to grasp the reality of nature, it doesn't matter if you're optimist or pessimist or something.
No. I have another detailed question. I didn't understand then what was the resolution of the whole thing about Goodman. On the one hand, I was in 36, he was saying, don't worry about it, you can reprint it, but take my name off it. And on the same month, he's saying, please print my replies. So what was your interpretation of that?
It doesn't go very deep, the interpretation, but my interpretation is that he was worried about what was attached to his name, and that he also was still very convinced of his. So it's true that because Hakewill turns it into a scholastic matter, and Goodman accepts that invitation. So in his responses to Hakewill, he starts also quoting like it's a lot about privatio as one of the main concepts of change out of Aristotelian philosophy, and Goodman uses it to say like privatio is actually movement through absence of what it should be. So the fact that privatio is the main principle of change in nature shows nature's corruption, because this principle of change is a principle out of a lack. So the acorn is not yet the oak. Well, the fact that that is the principle of change shows nature's inherent corruption. So he really engages in the scholastic discussion. And then I think that for some reason, but I don't know why, that he feels like the fall of man is politically dangerous.
Because it's about religion, and
it's probably he also understood that it was too Catholic or something, but defending the position scholastically was maybe less, but I don't know. I found it. I mean, it's also the Goodman text was extremely rare until 2000, the year 2000. It is an extremely rare text, so only when it was made available digitally, it became accessible. So that's also another banal reason why Jones is still the authority, is that no one could lay their hands on Goodman's texts.
And then I have a question about that, because a lot of us are PhD students here. How are you, because so there's a lot of, so I see you, I'm going back to being a lot of parentheses in my question. But I see that your presentation, I saw it 2 years ago, much shorter, but now I feel like it has gained a lot of legs and feet and eyes, and so there's a lot of levels of analysis, right? There's a whole thing about sort of how it becomes an epistemic object, the debate itself, about nature, and then it's about sort of, if you take seriously some of those actors' categories, it's about metaphysics, it's about literary, it's about religion. And so I'm wondering how you are going to structure that in the dissertation. So what, like, is it a chronological? Because you do that very well, sort of both following thematic analysis, but at the same time, and their chronology gets like, sometimes we go back and forward, and I think that that's really cool. But sometimes it's chronological when you do more reviews of reviews. And so I'm wondering how you're going to structure that in the dissertation.
No, I struggled a lot with that in the last month, because it's, it's a rhetorical trick, but it's also really true. I don't know how to introduce the subject, because this was also, I started writing some months ago, and it was then also that I started to really frame this question of like, but what type of epistemic object is it? And how am I, like, because whatever, it's like, I first wrote a long introduction with the Great Snow and like all these citing out of all the diaries, because it's also very juicy material. Yeah. But then I felt also like, now I open with giving it reality. So then I need to like go to the Eucharist or something to sort of immediately contradict that with something that seems unreal to me also. But then I actually was like, whoa, but these questions of the Eucharist are actually, I started reading about it. It's like it's talking about whether or not there is a real event and what is a real, like, and this tends so much into my more methodological questions with Certeau of like what really happens and how to like. And then I was like, oh no, I should start like that then, because then I can do an introduction of methodology through the Eucharist. And I think I wrote like 6 times 60 pages and always started again because I felt it was the wrong order. And then I thought I should work chronologically. I was like, okay, but then where do I start? I don't know. So but now I have I'm open actually with something I completely skipped here, and that's more the tradition of the text itself, of Goodman's text, because there's quite some priests who have these sort of exhortations. Yeah. And then a bit more like the apocalyptical tradition that this is in and how Hakewill fits in there. And then I go through the 20th century archive, like, okay, what is this object? And now my introduction is through the marginality of the case to frame a bit like, okay, how, like, it's a bit tricky. But I imagine I will still, and then to go, because also that was more my talk 2 years ago, like then the actual analysis of what goes on is, I think, or what I think is at stake between Goodman and Hakewill is indeed like the correct distribution between eternity and historicity, and between what can change, what we can change, and what we cannot. And I like starting a bit from this Hill's phrase that Hakewill is an activist, like how like it's impossible not to read it like that for us, but what is that in its own time? Like how Francis Bacon indeed all of a sudden comes to this idea that we should change nature, and it's actually wild that no one said that at the time, that you wouldn't do that. So this, yeah, so now it goes more that direction.
Yeah.
If I may, I'm curious to have more information about how you use John Donne, because you insist on the fact, metaphysical poets,
Yeah.
but this movement was identified later as a group of artists. So during the time of John Donne and Goodman, which is close, how John Donne was read, because it's a very difficult poet to read.
Yeah.
So how do you use it in your dissertation? How do you see his representativity?
There I think also it's again a bit using the recent interpretations as a bridge to try to approach. Like I've not done the work of looking how he was perceived in his own time, or read in his own time. He was very popular. Yeah, so his imagination spoke. But I think actually how I decided to include John Donne is because he appeared in a very political work called The Undercommons. It's like very hip in art scenes also, and it's from two decolonial scholars who are trying to define a study space that is a sort of shadow space to the university. So starting a lot from the problems in the university, but there's also a lot of means in university. And so how can we become independent, but using these means? And then like it's like a very weird book with a lot of dialogues in it, and also trying to be very an alternative. But it's introduced by I forgot his name now. Jack Halberstam, and at some point he talks about Frantz Fanon and one of the authors' interpretation of Fanon as someone who did not only refuse colonialism, but wanted to find a way to refuse a world in which colonialism makes sense. So I was intrigued by this difference, and then all of a sudden he quotes John Donne's poetry. Like he says, like Frantz Fanon lives in refusal, in constant refusal. There is nothing that can already be a solution to his problem, because it needs to be in a world that we cannot imagine. So we cannot imagine a solution neither. And then he, like out of nowhere, it's like he lives in a world that is that lives in absence, in darkness, in things which are not, as John Donne would say. And I was like, whoa, okay, John Donne pops up here, like in this work, like, okay, so, and I feel like this echo that there is now, that we feel like we're like in the 17th century in some aspects. Yeah, also a lot of the more late 20th century references to Goodman and Hakewill are very often about a world that is ending, which is indeed, that's like the other reality that is given to Goodman's speech. It's like, he talks about the end of the world. Well, he was right. The world ended in the early 17th century. And it's a bit the same that is done with John Donne. It's like, but he was right. All coherence was gone. Like, and there was a whole new coherence. Like, there was a whole new world constructed. And I think so, and it's also a bit the Jenny Bulstrode case is a bit the same for me. That's like, she's then claimed to be a historian who wants to defile, like at some point the word defile is used, like she wants to defile the British Empire. And what I find intriguing, and it's a bit a Certeau comment, it's like these critics of her just end there and say like, and therefore she's biased because she wants to defile the British. Wait a minute, she wants to defile the British Empire, why? Like she is a product of the, like she is sponsored by the, like, and all these institutions that support her, they kept defending her. They're like the British Historical Society, they all kept defending her. So that means that they also want to defile the British Empire. So what is this like? The same with John Donne. It's like, why do you want to, like John Donne also at some point gave a speech at the wedding of his daughter. And I think most about it was how after death, all our bodies are eaten by worms. It's like, that's quite something to say at someone's wedding. You know, it's like, I had this obsession with this like corruption and things dying and needing to be dead. But so I was more trying to like, how can John Donne show some, like also how we find him now interesting, like what is this to desire corruption? And I think Goodman, I mean, some say that Goodman read Donne and was clearly, some say that Donne read Goodman and was clearly influenced. Okay. Yeah, but these are things that don't have footnotes and that I have not been able to convincingly find myself.
But you see a clear family resemblance.
Yeah, but also there's but this is like all these other texts. You have the earliest one is Shackleton, a blazing star, who reacts to the new star that appeared in England, and it's also like this is a clear sign of the world ending. You have John Dee also, who worked as a mathematician for Elizabeth. Like Queen Elizabeth asked him to interpret the news. He's also like, yeah, it's a clear sign of the corruption of the heavens, and so it's like. Yeah, the Donne and like, yeah, but what is the sentiment that they were all like, Melanchthon once opened a lecture for students with like, it is clear that the universe is decaying and corrupt. So it was like a trope. And John Donne is probably the one who has like the most absurd way of having used that trope. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But maybe with John Dee, what would be interesting, but if you continue on that, but you have to finish your dissertation. So John Dee he was not sent at the same time at the court of the emperor with Kepler and Tycho Brahe, who were also weirdos about new stars and decay and weirdos. I should not say that. They were deeply involved in a notion of the decaying universe for a Christian reason, which we are fallen. You know, the world is going, it's not happy ever after if you're a Christian. And so it was common, as you said.
Yeah, this idea.
But maybe this position of Goodman, this way to argue and the reaction is more unique. It's and early. Compared to other debate later about the nature.
Yeah, because it is also a bit hard to really, because in these other texts, it's like there's so many examples of texts in which this trope comes, but it's always a bit like by the way, or like like it's often talking about moral corruption and this is also reflected in the fact that nature is decaying, and then but so no one really. It's indeed true that it's only with Goodman and Hakewill it seems that that became something that needed to be proven, like, okay, but it's as if indeed, but I have it a bit that Hakewill sometimes for me reads a bit as someone like Brian Vickers arguing against Merchant. Like Merchant is like, yeah, there is clear, Merchant also says at some point, I am interested in the metaphors used by these heroes of modern science. And Bacon talked about the holes of nature and penetrating them and the secrets of nature and unveiling her and blah, blah, blah. And then this Brian Vickers goes like, but you have not understood that it is a metaphor and nature cannot actually decay. And sometimes for me, Goodman is like, and the corruption and the death of the universe, and we're going to, and Hakewill goes like, yeah, but it's not correct what you like, and this is funny in a way because it's like, but Goodman wasn't really arguing for nature's decay. It's not at all comparable to climate scientists today, for example, which is the easy, like the seems an evident comparison. He's just like,
But the book is called The Fall of Man, not The Decay of Nature.
Which is what Hakewill tells him over and over again. Like, you have not proven decay, you have only proven fall, which Hakewill also accepts as a dogma. So Hakewill often, when Goodman says, and worms exist, and Hakewill says, well, first, worms are actually good if you look at the bigger picture. And second, even if they were not good, now you've only shown corruption and not decay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know what else.
We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Question, which is a little bit of a follow-up. It's about this apocalyptic theme. I'm just curious whether they, for example, for Goodman, whether they had some apocalyptic significance, or he would separate this matter as saying, like, look, decay of nature is one thing, but does he infer directly, like, I don't know, that apocalypse is on the way?
Yeah, so that's also, so he proposes his work as a work addressed at rational men, not Christian men.
Okay.
So he proposes in the beginning that, he says that he the day that is for him the most beautiful day of the year is the 6th of January, which commemorates the conversion of the heathen, like the heathen who come to see Christ and found Christ from afar, guided by a star, and the star is then representing the ratio. And he sees himself as wanting to do that, to lead the ones from afar, from the east, through the star to Christ. And so he says that, he repeatedly says things like, by pointing man out the fact that he is fallen, he will realize, it's a bit also what Bacon is doing. It's like, if you realize that this is a broken state, what you automatically want to do is to look for the unbroken state. So to the place whence he is fallen, he calls it. So he's like, I'm going to rationally convince man that this is not how things should be, so that they will understand the truth of Christianity. And then he says in the beginning, therefore, I will not presuppose revelation in showing the decay of man. So I will also not, and then he says, the exact way and moment of the apocalypse is only revealed knowledge. That is not, we cannot know that, and especially not through nature. But then he does do like, the last chapter of the book is like, okay, now I all the time didn't use Revelation, and now I will say what also in Revelation is actually said about the matter. And then he goes like but then in the discussion with Hakewill, they have a quite elaborate discussion, which I'm also trying to understand because it's very technical, about the difference between the world being purified by fire, as is said in some fragments of Revelation, and others say that it will be consumed by fire. And this is, again, like actually what now more interests me theologically and metaphysically is almost is like, why is it so interesting to talk about the difference between a purification and a consummation? And I feel like I recognize a bit political discussions today between like sort of accelerationism, wanting to destroy, versus reformist, like the basic structure of things should stay the same and it just needs to be purified. And that like they're fighting about like, no, it should be consumed as a whole, or it should be just purified. And so in the actual controversy, they then actually use a lot more theological stuff, but in the original text, Goodman does not go into this so much.
I have a methodological question. I was surprised that there was not more discussion of this in the 19th century.
Of the case?
Of the case. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was also a lot of debates about perhaps not what the optimism, and so I'm wondering whether that has to do with the methodology of that you couldn't find some stuff, or do you think there's something historically real about the fact that it was not discussed in the 19th century for some reasons?
Yeah, I guess it seemed because they are both clergymen also, so it's a very like theological thing, like also in the titles and stuff. So I want, because the way that I entered the 19th century is to Bury's idea of progress. He mentions with only Hakewill actually, not Goodman. And then Bury also, I was a bit reading then this book itself, and then indeed you come into these debates on like the late 19th century debates on progress. But also Bury is not actually, so he somehow found Hakewill's texts. He's also not too interested in it. He just mentions it a bit as an example of, so well, I don't know. I think my hypothesis would be that it's too theological in nature then.
That natural science was a lot about evolution and change, but in a moment already where the scientific categories were being established and where the only use would be to say, well, look, this is a moment where the pre-scientific revolution sort of a good one kind of thing.
But Max, you have to be careful about that, because even the word scientific revolution is probably really bad. It's more complicated than that. It's in the history of the winner.
Yeah, sure, but that's
so when you go, as you know, when you go back in the text of that period, there's a lot of stuff whoops, disappear in the official history. So maybe 19th century is the period where it's in your interest to disconnect
These-
all this religious thinking. And that's what we call today science. And at that time, it was pretty mixed and complicated.
But that's why I was surprised that it was not taught more in the 19th century, because it would fit this sort of, as the debate would be this object where science finally won, where Hakewill sort of defeated the pessimist, and now we have optimism and we have order. It fits with, and that's why I was a bit surprised.
But I think it was not, but this, I mean, also if someone would ever, I'm still looking for, in the beginning of the 20th century, it's immediately Jones, Harris, and some other papers. It's called like a very popular debate. Goodman's text is often called a very popular text in its time. Hakewill's text is often called a very popular text in its time. So it's like, okay, then why indeed was it forgotten for 3 centuries? And now, I mean, I could read all the references to Goodman and Hakewill and their controversy. It took me 2 months, but I read it, like, it's like, that's very limited still. The last one was also interesting. The last reference, I mean, now not anymore maybe, that I then found was 2024, a paper on Israel's environmental science and how it exported it as like the creation of paradise, that they succeeded to turn the desert into fertile land, and how, like, as a political construct, this was being exported. And then there is a reference to Hakewill as a big like a bit of a Bacon-esque violator, also of like someone who started this idea that we should just not accept it when a desert is a desert and not fruitful. I thought it was like, yeah, so you start to see, like, now I'm a bit scared even to look again, because it has been almost a year. It's like, it's now maybe I find like 2,000 more references and it exploded, and I'm just too late with my, and I with my thesis.
Okay, then I think if there are no more questions, then we can close it here. Thank you so much.